So this is part 2 of the contemporary compatibilism lecture. So we went through these concepts, the compatibilist burden in part 1, what it is the compatibilist is trying to show, the difference between classical and contemporary compatibilisms, classical sort of focusing on doing what you want unimpeded, and then contemporary compatibilists focusing on identifying what it means to have and exercise proper or normal functioning of a human agency. And the mesh theories that we talked about in part 1 are trying to say that free will and responsibility is about having this harmonious kind of meshing of your psychology, right? And to have your actions caused by a properly meshed psychology is what it is for them to be free and for you to be responsible. And we saw Frankfurt's he's the sort of main mesh theorist, this hierarchical theory where having the desires that cause your actions, your will, align with your second order desires, your higher order desires, that those desires be effective. So in particular, your volitions, having your volitions and your will align and not be impeded. And then also adding the fact that you identify with or endorse those desires that cause you to act. That is the kind of picture of a properly meshed psychology for Frankfurt. And then we saw, where did it go? Some worries with that. And then Watson's kind of modification of this, where instead of having hierarchical desires, you have this these two parallel structures, these two parallel systems being properly structured together. So your motivational system and your evaluative judgment and what it is for you to sort of act freely and for your action to reflect who you are is for your desires that cause you to act to be aligned with your considered evaluative judgments about what it's best to do. Okay, and then Bratman's theory kind of modified Frankfurt in a different way, where he thought the main thing were these self-governing policies, these higher order intentions that carry over through time and that constrain your other plans and intentions to do certain things. And when your intentions, desires, plans, when those intentions, desires, and plans that sort of are involved in causing your actions are aligned with those self-governing policies or mesh with them, then that's what it means for that action to be free, because this is sort of who you are. And so when those actions that are caused by your intentions align with your self-governing policies, and more particularly when the intentions that cause you to act, or the desires that cause you to act, align with those higher order intentions, those self-governing policies, that's what it means for you to act freely and responsibly. So now we will shift to these reasons-responsiveness theories. And we'll look very briefly at Susan Wolf's, and then we will look at the most famous from John Fisher and Mark Revisa. These are going to be the reasons-responsiveness theories. And they are going to focus on what it means to be appropriately sensitive to the reasons. So, sorry, I get a little ahead of myself. Focusing on what it means to exercise proper human agency or a human agency that's functioning normally, they're going to say that is about being properly sensitive to the reasons. Okay. And that is going to be this capacity to be sensitive to the relevant reasons is going to be what matters for free will and responsibility. Okay. So we'll look first at Susan Wolf's. This reason was called the reason view or sanity view. So Wolf was kind of not happy with these previous views we've been talking about, what she called them real self views, because roughly what they're saying is for an action to be free or responsible is for it to kind of represent or come from, or both, your true self. And this causal connection between your action and a properly meshed psychology is just another way of saying that your action sort of belongs to you. It's your own. It represents who you are. And that's what it means to act freely, is for your actions to come from your true self. And so Frankfurt and Watson and Bratman give this causal story about what it means for your actions to truly come from your true, or to genuinely come from your true self. And she thought, well, I don't really like these true self or real self views because not just sort of ordinary manipulation, but a kind of case in which you might have someone who's raised to be a terrible self, right? Who, because of their upbringing, their true self, their real self, is awful. They might be raised, so think of like Saddam Hussein's son or something, who's just didn't really have any opportunities to be anybody but an evil person, right? And she has this case of JoJo, who's kind of like that, who's raised by evil people, evil dictator, evil society. I can't remember the details, but you get JoJo, who's this evil person, but it's because of this upbringing he had that it was totally beyond his control. And therefore, it's not just the manipulation. It's not just that there was some cause of who he is. It's that he doesn't even have the capacity to be sensitive to the relevant reasons, the relevant moral reasons. What is truly means to be good, the true moral reasons about how to act good, how to act well in accordance with the good, right? This ability to do the right things for the right reasons, JoJo doesn't even have that ability because he was raised to either not care about morality or have some sort of backwards morality where like harming people is good. And because of that, he can't really do anything about that. He just doesn't have the capacity to understand that what he's doing is wrong because his sense of wrong, morality, and what the right reasons are is flipped. And he's evil. He has an evil psychology, self, basically. And Susan Wolf thought, well, if you take these views, the real self views from Frankfurt, where you have your desires aligning with these second order desires and you endorse them, or if you have your motivational states, your desires aligning with your evaluative judgments, or if you even have Brotman's, where you have these self-governing policies about what you intend to do over time that sort of structure your actions and constrain your actions and intentions later. The higher order stuff, whether it's self-governing policies, whether it's evaluative judgments, or whether it is higher order volitions, higher order desires, those can be, if you're JoJo, these evil people who are raised in evil scenarios, all of those things are going to be evil. You're just going to have higher order desires, evaluative judgments, and so on that are evil and not sensitive to the actual good moral reasons. And it's going to be no fault of their own that they don't have this capacity. And so she thought the other views are going to get the wrong answer on this. They're going to say that this person is responsible, is blameworthy for doing what they do because their actions, their desires, their judgments about what's good and bad represent their true self according to these other views. Because your true self just is your governing policies, or it just is sort of fundamentally, at least, what comes from your evaluative judgments. Or for Frankfurt, it just is fundamentally your volitions, your higher order desires, and your endorsements. But if those things are coming from this evil upbringing, Wolf thought that's a problem. I don't think JoJo, who's raised to be evil through no fault of his own, should be blameworthy. And she says it's not because he's determined, not because people messed with his influence the way he was raised. It's not because of that. It's because he literally doesn't have the ability to do the right thing for the right reasons. He can't recognize the good because of the way he was raised, the true and the good. And she thought the ability, this capacity to do the right thing for the right reasons is what essentially matters to freedom and responsibility. She also thought that this is a non-historical view. She also thought that the way in which this capacity comes about is not really important. So again, JoJo is not excused because he was manipulated, because there was some causal story that he didn't control about, a causal story about him having this evil nature. It's not just that, because the way in which your ability comes about isn't supposed to matter. It's the fact that he doesn't even have this ability to do the right thing for the right reasons. And the reason he lacks that ability is not his fault. If it was his fault that he lacked that ability, if he pushed a button to get rid of that ability, hey, we'll get rid of this ability to recognize good reasons and to act in accordance with them, and you can push this button and that'll make you evil. All right, well, now we have him being responsible for being evil. But that's not the case. If it's this upbringing, before he had any rational capacities, that's responsible for that. Well, it's not the manipulation itself, it's the fact that he lacks this ability, right? So this kind of leads to this asymmetry thesis where blameworthiness requires the ability to do otherwise, but praiseworthiness does not. And the reason is that blameworthiness therefore, doing something bad requires the ability to do otherwise, because the ability to recognize and respond to the right reasons, the good reasons, we can't tell if you have that ability if you're just doing bad things. Right? So if you do something bad, the only way we can blame you is if you have this ability that you did not exercise. But if you do something bad and we think you're blameworthy, well, then that means you could have recognized the right reasons. You could have done the right thing for the right reasons. It has to be true that you could have done the right thing for the right reasons. And so if you don't do the right thing for the right reasons, yet we blame you, that means you did have the ability to do the right thing for the right reasons, even though you didn't do it, right? So if you're determined, though, to do bad, then you lack the ability. If you're determined to do bad, then you lack the ability to do the right thing for the right reasons, and that's what's important. So blameworthiness requires the ability to do otherwise. But praiseworthiness, if you're determined to do good, you can't do anything except for the right thing for the right reasons. Imagine like a perfect person, or like an angel, or a saint, right? They can't do anything except the right thing for the right reasons. But obviously they still have the ability. Even though they're determined, right? You can still have and exercise the ability to do the right thing for the right reasons. In fact, you're determined to have it and to exercise it, right? But it's just about having this ability. And that's why if you're blameworthy, we can't really tell right away whether you have it. So we need to ask this question about the ability to do otherwise. But if you're praiseworthy, it doesn't matter if you're determined, because we can see that you have this ability. You don't need the ability to do the wrong thing for the wrong reasons, right? That's not what's needed. What's needed is this thing. And if you're determined to do that thing, well, then who cares? You still have that thing. So interesting kind of piece of her view. There's a lot to talk about there, and people talk about, but we're just not going to get into that. What we're going to shift to is John Martin Fisher and Mark Revisa's view of what's often just called the Reasons-Responsiveness view. McKenna puts this into Reasons-Responsiveness view as well, which makes sense. But usually when people say Reasons-Responsiveness, they have Fisher and Revisa in mind, and in particular Fisher. Revisa doesn't really do philosophy anymore. I think I think Fisher said he became a clergy or something like that. The Reasons-Responsiveness view is fundamentally associated with Fisher and Revisa, and in particular Fisher, really, because he's the one who kept on modifying it and responding to objections, and still to this day engages with people over the pieces of this view. So his understanding of what Reasons-Responsiveness is, him and Revisa, is Revisa gets credit because he's a co-author of the book, so, and I think some other papers. So what it means to be reasons-responsive, what it means to be appropriately sensitive to the reasons, is to have what he calls guidance control, or what they call guidance control. All right, what is guidance control? Well, guidance control, we'll first contrast it with what they call regulative control. So regulative control is the ability to have, choose between two possible options. Okay, so regulative control requires that determinism is false. It requires indeterminism. And Fisher is a compatibilist, so he doesn't think that you need regulative control. Okay, he doesn't think you need that. You don't need the ability to do otherwise, basically. You need guidance control. You need to be caused in the right way. So let's see what that means. Now, what's important is the actual sequence mechanism. So what it means to act with guidance control is that the actual psychological mechanism that causes you to act is important here. That psychological mechanism, the issues in your action that causes you to act, whether that's a bunch of intentions and desires and beliefs or whatever it is, whatever the mental, psychological states and processes are that sort of lead to your action causally, that thing is what needs to be sensitive to the reasons. there's a debate in the literature over whether this is important or whether the agent who has this psychological mechanism is more important. We're going to set that aside. We don't need to worry about those details, but we'll talk. I'll sometimes even go back and forth, to be honest, because it just doesn't matter for our purposes, really. Just to kind of get the basic introduction to this. So to act with free will, to act responsibly, is for the agent, or with the mechanism that they have, the agent and their mechanism. I'll just put them together, probably. That's easier. The agent and their mechanism, their psychological mechanism of action, has to be sensitive to the appropriate reasons. And that means, were the agent in some relevantly similar circumstances to the circumstances in which they act. So say you are deciding whether to eat the cheesecake, right? It's at night, you wake up, you get a craving, you remember there's cheesecake in the fridge, and you go to the fridge, you open it, you're deliberating, you're like, oh my gosh, it looks so good, I don't know if I should do that, I'm on this diet, and you're kind of deliberating, and then you say, the hell with it, and you eat the cheesecake, right? So whether or not you are sensitive to the reasons is a question about what you would have done if you had other reasons, if other reasons were presented to you to not do that. So if somebody, like, we put you in the same situation where you wake up, you remember there's cheesecake, you go to the fridge, you're thinking about it, but then you realize, oh wait, my spouse said that they would divorce me if I ate the cheesecake. Would you still eat it? That seems like a good reason not to eat it. Would you respond to that reason? Would you be sensitive to that reason? What if, I know these might seem ridiculous, but you're about to decide whether to eat it, and then somebody busts in with a gun, is like, don't eat that cheesecake or I'll shoot you. Seems like a sufficient reason not to eat it. If you knew that eating the cheesecake would, like, blow up the world, would you eat it? If you knew that the cheesecake would give you a heart attack, would you eat it? Right? These are all, it sounds silly, but the point is just, when you're wondering whether somebody is free and responsible for the action that they performed, the reasons-responsiveness view, what they want you to do is say, what would the person have done if we had given them a bunch of different reasons that are related to that action? Would they have stopped? Would they have done something else if they had sufficient reason to? Because think of like an addict who has a desire to use heroin, and it's really strong. Let's say they're a really severe addict and they have this kind of irresistible, or at least near irresistible compulsion. Think of like a agoraphobic who doesn't want to leave their house, a kleptomaniac who can't help from stealing even when like cops are around. It's like, you might think that there are these conditions where even if people had really good reasons, even if they understood that there were really good reasons not to do what they do, not to do the thing, steal, let's say, and there's a cop there and they know they're going to get in trouble. They know that's like, this is not a good idea, but they just can't help it and they do it anyways. It seems like they're not sensitive to the relevant reasons, right? So we just ask this question. When somebody performs an action and we're wondering whether they're free and responsible, we ask, were the agent in some relevantly similar scenario, but where reasons to do otherwise were present, the agent would have been appropriately sensitive to the reasons. That's what it means to be sensitive. Were there reasons to do otherwise in a relevantly similar situation, the agent would have been sensitive to those reasons. Therefore, this is a counterfactual view. It's about what the agent and their mechanism would have done in some relevant possible situation, right? We kind of like, after they perform an action, we then wonder, we like think and try to figure out what they would have done in other possible situations. Okay? So, this counterfactual view means we need to like ask what they would have done. Not just what they did, but what would they have done in relevant situations like that. Relevantly similar situations. And there's two kind of components to this sensitivity. It's reasons-responsiveness. One is receptivity. So that's the capacity to understand that something's a reason. Here, I'll just bring this up. The capacity to, so say here's an action, right? I forgot to switch these for you, sorry. Phi is, I used this in a talk recently. Phi is a kind of classic philosophy symbol for an action. I've been using A or B or whatever for you guys, but so just imagine this is an A. There's moral reasons, call the moral reasons R, some moral reasons for or against, either way, doing A or Phi. And then the agent S does the action, or if there's reasons against it, they don't do it for that. But how do you get from the reasons to doing the action for those reasons? So you have the person, they have some psychological mechanisms, some cognitive abilities, rational abilities, deliberative abilities, and using that psychological mechanism, they recognize those moral reasons. They're like, oh, okay, the fact that my spouse is going to divorce me if I eat this cheesecake, that is a good reason not to eat it, right? We haven't gotten to the action yet, just recognizing the reasons as reasons, recognizing some fact. The fact that my punching you will hurt you, and the fact that I don't have any reason to punch you. Those two facts are reasons not to punch you. The fact that you're innocent and the fact that punching you will hurt you. Those are two reasons not to punch you, right? Those are moral reasons against punching you. And if I can recognize your innocence and the potential pain of my punching you as reasons not to do it, that is what it means to be receptive to reasons. I have the capacity to understand and appreciate that something is a reason for or against acting, right? And then there's reactivity. And that's the capacity to take those reasons, and more particularly, take your understanding of those reasons as reasons and turn them into actions that align with those reasons. So the capacity to make your actions track the reasons that you recognize. The capacity to act for the reasons that you recognize. That's reactivity. And you see these come apart. Some people might understand the reasons, like an addict who recognizes that they shouldn't use, that it's bad to use, that they're causing problems by using, but they can't turn that recognition of reasons into action. They still act against those reasons, even though that they recognize they have a lot of reasons to use or to not use, they still use anyways. So they might be receptive but not reactive, right? And you can also have reactivity. You can have the capacity to act for certain reasons, or at least act in accordance, maybe not for, but in accordance with certain reasons, even though you didn't recognize them. So the point is just that these things can come apart. You can be receptive without reactivity. That's enough to make them come apart. So you need to be able to have these two capacities, to understand the reasons and to act in accordance with them. That's two capacities that go together to make reasons-responsiveness. Okay. Now there's different degrees of reasons-responsiveness. You might recognize lots of reasons, right? You might have the capacity to recognize all kinds of reasons for and against using drugs or eating sweets or whatever it is, punching people. And then you might react to some of those reasons, but not all of them. So think of, again, like someone who's a kleptomaniac who can recognize it, like, if I steal this, then I'm going to get shot by this cop. Let's say they're in some, really, really sort of tyrannical, authoritative country, and you can get shot on the spot for stealing, even like a candy bar. I don't know if any countries are like this, but let's imagine there was one. Someone might be a kleptomaniac and have this compulsion towards stealing, but still not steal. Still not steal in that situation, because it's really extreme. It's a really, really extreme reason, extreme consequence. They're going to get potentially killed if they steal. And so maybe that's enough to keep them from stealing, but they don't respond to lots of other reasons, like they're harming the business owner, they're being unvirtuous, right? They might get arrested, they might have to pay a fine. Like, they don't really care enough about those reasons, or at least they're not sensitive to those reasons. But you can see that there's like this degree that you can be sensitive, you can be receptive to more or less reasons for some action, and you can be reactive to more or less of those reasons. So you might be like able to understand all the reasons, that count against doing something, but you might not react to any of them. You might do that thing anyways. Okay, so how much receptivity and reactivity do you need? Well, Fisher and Revisa said you don't have to be reactive and responsive to all the reasons. So if we plopped you, so imagine we plopped you, the actual world is in green. So let's say some agent does some action, phi, for some reason or whatever, in the actual world. But then we look at all these different possible scenarios that are very similar to this scenario, where you're deciding to use drugs or deciding to eat the cheesecake or deciding whether to punch someone or deciding whether to take a job or whatever it is. And then we just imagine possible scenarios that are very similar, except we change the reasons that you have. We're like, well, what would this person do in that same scenario, but with different reasons? What would the person do in the same scenario, but with another set of reasons? And the very similar scenario, but with different reasons. Now we make it so that, well, if you take this job, then you're going to have to move. If you take this job, then your spouse is going to divorce you. If you take this job, then you're going to make less money. If you take this job, then you're going to have to live in the city that you hate. Like all these different reasons, and we see how you react to them. And then we just kind of do this test. All the possible different reasons you could have. And in this diagram here, just imagine green means that they actually recognize the reason. And red means that they don't even recognize it. They're not sensitive to it. So if the person does this action in the actual world, and then we imagine what they would have done with different reasons, sufficient reasons not to act, then the person might recognize them and therefore not. Remember the tilde, the little squiggly line is a not. They don't do that thing because they did recognize the reasons not to do it and they acted accordingly. So a world like this where you have green, which means they recognize the reason, and the opposite, so here they did it and here they didn't do it because they recognize reasons not to do it. This represents being at least partly sensitive to the reasons. And then look, we have different reasons, and they recognize those, and they also stopped doing what they were doing, or didn't do what they do in the actual world, right? And then another world where we give them even different reasons not to do that thing. And then look, they recognize them, and then they didn't do that thing because of those reasons. But sometimes people will not recognize the reasons, and so they'll still do it anyways, right? Sometimes they might recognize the reasons and still do it anyways. So this is obviously not sensitive. They're not sensitive to the reasons, and they don't act accordingly because they don't recognize them. So they still do this thing, even though they had reasons not to. But it's red. It's because they didn't recognize those reasons. But even in a situation like this, where you look at a very similar scenario, but then you give them different reasons not to do that thing, they might recognize them as reasons. Like, oh yeah, there is a good reason not to do that, but still do it anyways. See, they still did phi. So this is a partial sensitivity. They're receptive to the reasons, but not reactive to them. And then we just look at all the relevant scenarios, and then we ask, how sensitive is this person to phi-related reasons? How many scenarios do they recognize reasons? How many scenarios do they recognize reasons and then not do the thing that they did in the actual world? How many scenarios do they recognize the reasons not to do it but still do it anyways? And then we just kind of measure all those up, and that will tell us how responsive, how sensitive they are to the reasons. Okay, now how much sensitivity do they need in order to be free and responsible? Well, Fisher and Revisa called it moderate reasons-responsiveness. But what that means is a regular receptivity. So it's going to be a combination, I should say. It's going to be a combination of these, right? If this is reasons-responsiveness, if it's these two capacities, to understand reasons and to make your actions track those reasons, well, you're going to need some combination of receptivity and reactivity because they come apart. You can be receptive without being reactive. So you need some combination. Well, the combination that Fisher and Revisa thought was appropriate was what they called regular receptivity and weak reactivity. So regular receptivity is that the agent would recognize reasons in some sufficient range of relevantly similar worlds. So let's say in 80%, you can't see all the worlds, obviously, but let's say some person is deciding whether to use drugs, and they do use drugs. They use heroin, let's say. They have a desire to use heroin, and based on that desire, they use heroin. Well, now we want to ask, did they use heroin freely and responsibly in the actual world? Well, in order to answer that question, Fisher and Revisa say we need to figure out how sensitive to the reasons they were. How sensitive to the reasons the agent working with their actual sequence mechanism, the psychological capacity that actually caused them to use heroin here. How sensitive to reasons is that mechanism? So we take the agent with that mechanism that they actually used, and we hold them fixed, and we plop them into all these other scenarios, and we just changed all the reasons. We keep everything the same, but then we just change little things so that the reasons change. Okay, and based on that, then we can say, okay, how sensitive are they? Well, Fisher says, as long as we get enough green, let's say if we had like 80% of the possible situations in which we put this heroin user into the similar type of scenario, but where we start giving them reasons not to do the heroin. So you're like, oh, okay, same exact scenario, only your friends are going to hate you if you use heroin. Same exact scenario, only you're going to OD if you use heroin. Do they understand those reasons? That's the first question. And if in enough possible scenarios, in a sufficient range of relevantly similar scenarios, the agent would recognize reasons, that's regular receptivity. How much is sufficient? Well, they say, that's why sane is here. They say like, well, it's like a sane pattern, meaning that an objective third party would look at the pattern of worlds in which you recognize reasons and say, yeah, that looks good. That looks like it's based on the evidence in the right way. It looks normal to me. And so it's not super clear what sufficient or sane is supposed to mean, but some sufficient range of scenarios where you recognize reasons. We haven't talked about acting yet, just recognizing reasons. So in order to be appropriately sensitive, you have to be at least regularly receptive to the reasons to do otherwise. Okay. And then you need weak reactivity, meaning in the worlds, in the green worlds, the green R worlds, so the green R's mean that you are receptive to the reasons. You do understand that there are reasons not to do that thing. Okay. Now, you just need, in at least one of those worlds, the agent acts according to the reasons. All of these the R's here represent reasons to not do phi. That's what's relevant. So if you do some action, we want to know, would you have responded to reasons not to do that thing? Okay. Would you have responded to reasons not to do that thing? That's the question. And in at least one of those scenarios where you do recognize reasons, if you respond to them and don't actually do the thing because you had reasons not to do it and then you responded accordingly and didn't do it, you just need one scenario. So when you get regular receptivity to the reasons, okay, when in most situations, when we would tell you some reason not to do something, some sufficient reason, some reason that's actually sufficient for not doing that thing, it's a morally satisfactory reason for not doing it, then you would recognize that. You would understand that in a lot of the worlds, in a lot of those scenarios. And then in at least one of those scenarios where you do understand the reasons not to do the thing, you actually don't do the thing. That's moderate reasons-responsiveness. Okay. Now, in addition to that, you have to have ownership of the mechanism. So the mechanism that sort of issues in your action, that leads to your action, you have to take ownership of that. So what that means is you have to see yourself as capable of shaping the world. Okay, it's capable of being an agent who can make changes to the world and affect things in the world. You have to see yourself as an appropriate target of the reactive attitudes, and you should remember those from last week. These blaming attitudes, resentment, indignation, and then also praising ones like gratitude, self-blaming like guilt. So these reactive attitudes, if you see yourself as someone who's subject to the attitudes of the moral community, then that's part of taking ownership. And then again, if you see yourself as capable of shaping the world and as a subject of the reactive attitudes based on the actual evidence. Your evidence for seeing yourself in that way has to be sort of reality, right? You can't be manipulated, they want to say, into seeing yourself in this way, but the question will come back up later. So what does it mean to be responsible and free, to act freely and responsibly for Fisher and Revisa? It means acting with guidance control. Well, what is guidance control? Guidance control is when the psychological mechanism that causes you to act is appropriately sensitive to the reasons. What does that mean? Well, sensitivity of your psychological mechanism means, were you in relevantly similar scenarios where other reasons not to do what you did were present, you would have been sensitive to those reasons. What does that mean to be sensitive to them? Well, you would have understood them, understood that those were reasons not to act, and you would have done so in a sufficient range of possible similar scenarios. And in at least one of those scenarios, when you recognize reasons not to act, you also would not act according to those reasons. Okay. And then, in addition, you have to take ownership of your psychological mechanism. It has to be your own in a certain way. This kind of gives you this authorship condition. It makes it so that the actions are sort of representative of who you are, because the mechanism that caused them is one that you kind of, it's almost like an endorsement condition. You identify with it, you endorse it, because you see yourself with acting with this mechanism. You see yourself as capable of shaping the world, as an agent who's in the moral community and who's subject to be blamed if you do something wrong. You recognize all these things. Okay, that's what it means. All right, so now let's look at some worries with this view. So there's 6 in the book, and there's more and different ways in which you could reformulate kind of the similar ideas, some of these objections, but I'll just go through McKenna's objections and then I add one at the end. So the one problem is with receptivity. So it seems like, so Fisher and Revisa require that an agent, in order to be responsible and free, has to have a certain kind of receptivity to the reasons. That's, again, is the capacity to understand and appreciate that something is a reason for or against acting. Well, it seems like we might ask, doesn't the agent have to recognize the actual moral reasons? Guidance control, this thing we just covered, it only requires that the agent be regularly receptive in some possible range. So like, here's the actual scenario. The person's deciding whether to do drugs. Maybe their friends are egging them on. Maybe they're just really craving it. Maybe they're an addict. Maybe they just want to have fun or party or go with their desires or whatever. And then they do the thing. Well, Fisher says, in order to test whether they're free and responsible here in the actual scenario, we need to look at all these other possible scenarios that could have happened and see what they would have done. Well, you might ask, what about the actual reasons? You could not even be you cannot be sensitive to reasons in the reasons that are actually present. Right? There could have been moral reasons not to use the drugs, right? Present to you in the actual scenario. But that's not enough. You might have even ignored those reasons, not recognized them, not reacted to them, but that doesn't matter. What matters is how you would have acted in all these other different possible scenarios that didn't even occur. So you might think, since guidance control, Fisher's account, only requires that the agent be, quote, regularly receptive in some sufficient range of possible scenarios that are, of course, that they have to be relevantly similar to the actual scenario, but they're possible scenarios. They're not the actual scenario. But then someone could be morally responsible for something without even having understood the actual moral reasons in the actual scenario. doesn't that matter? You might say the agent doesn't have to recognize the actual moral reasons in order to be responsible for their action. So that's a question. Another question is with reactivity. So you might say, really? The agent only needs to be reactive in one possible scenario? So imagine there was a lot of moral reasons not to do heroin here, but the person does it anyways. Not only does it not matter that they didn't recognize those reasons in the actual scenario, it also seems to not matter. The only thing that seems to matter is that they be receptive to reasons in a big range of scenarios, but only one possible situation in which they would have reacted seems to be enough. So if you have an example like the person who's deathly afraid of going outside, and the only thing that would get them to go outside is if, say, their house caught on fire. Right? That's the only thing that would get them outside. They're extreme agoraphobic. Well, does that seem like they're free and responsible? If they don't recognize reasons in all these other scenarios, but there's this one possible scenario where if they would have seen that their house was on fire, then they would have ran out of the house. How does that show that they're free and responsible in all these ordinary scenarios? Or they have good reasons to leave, like their kid's wedding is happening, but they're too scared to go outside. Well, are they free and like blameworthy for missing the wedding? Well, if Fisher says, well, if in a lot of other scenarios they would have recognized reasons, and if there's at least one scenario where they would have responded to those reasons, like their house catching on fire, then yeah, that's enough to say that in the actual scenario they controlled their action. That just seems like too thin. You can be morally responsible even if only the most extreme scenario would have made you refrain from what you did. And ultimately Fisher agrees, and he thinks, yeah, maybe we should add a stronger requirement there. Maybe it needs to be more than one. But now you have a problem of saying, well, how much? How many scenarios? So another thing to think about. There's also a problem with mechanisms. So roughly the problem is, how do you identify the mechanism? So remember, the actual sequence mechanism, the psychological mechanism that issues in your action, that causes you to act. We need to figure out what that is. Is it your desire? Is it your values? Is it a bunch of beliefs that you have? Is it, if you're an addict and you have a really strong craving, and the craving makes you perform the action, makes you take drugs? Is the craving part of your actual sequence mechanism? Or is your actual sequence mechanism something else and the craving just kind of influenced it, but it's not really a part of it? The reason that's important is because when we test your sensitivity to reasons in these other possible scenarios, when we say, hey, would you have still done heroin if we would have told you that your friends would have like unfriended you or whatever, not been your friends anymore? Would you still have done heroin? What about if you knew you were going to lose your job? Would you still have done heroin? Well, in order to test that in these possible scenarios, we have to know what your psychological mechanism was, because we're supposed to be holding it fixed. You're supposed to have the same exact psychological mechanism that caused you to do the action is supposed to be present, because we want to know how sensitive that mechanism is to reasons. But it seems difficult to identify it. We don't know what it is. So guidance control is supposed to be a property of that mechanism. The sensitivity to reasons, which is called guidance control, is supposed to be a property of that mechanism, and so we need to know what the mechanism is. Right? But Fisher and Revisa don't tell us how to identify it. They basically say, we just use our intuition. That's what we do. So there's this, that's a problem. Another problem is there's this problem with ownership. Okay, one problem with ownership is manipulation. We might ask, can't the agent just be manipulated into taking ownership? It's not clear why they can't. Ownership is just a group of attitudes, right? Ownership is just, you see yourself as capable of shaping the world. You see yourself as subject to the reactive attitudes. Of course, they do say the seeing yourself in this way has to be based in an appropriate way on the evidence, but it's not clear what this means. You can be manipulated into seeing yourself, but you can be manipulated into seeing yourself in this way based on the evidence. We can just manipulate you so you're sensitive to the evidence, and it's through no fault of your own that you are responsive to the evidence and see yourself as a moral subject and all that. It's just not clear why these can't be manipulated into the agent. Right? And if manipulation's there, it seems non-responsible, but it seems like, again, because of the compatibilist burden, you get you get the conditions that are supposed to be sufficient enough for responsibility. But because those conditions came about by manipulation, we worry that the person's not responsible. Right? And he can try to resist this possibility and say, no, you can't be manipulated. But then he's going to need to give us a story about like what it means for it to be based on the evidence in an appropriate way. Or you can just accept, like Frankfurt does, that if you're manipulated into being reasons responsive, then you're just responsible. So take a pick, Fisher. Okay. Now, problems with ownership. Excuse me. And I can't remember. I think he's back and forth. Sometimes he says, well, maybe you're responsible if you're manipulated, but not blameworthy. He tries to go that route sometimes. And so then you'd have the burden of saying what it means to be responsible without being blameworthy, which seems a little hard. But ownership. Okay, yeah. So he's got to figure out how to respond to the manipulation stuff. And he's responded in a few different ways. All right. Now, there's also a problem with ownership and subjectivity. So notice that ownership is required to be responsible. You can't just have the mechanism be sensitive. You also have to see yourself in certain ways. Your mechanism has to be your own. You have to take ownership of your mechanism. Your mechanism has to be sensitive to reasons, for sure, but you also have to take ownership of it, meaning you have to see yourself in certain ways. Now, what if you just don't see yourself in those ways? What if your mechanism is sensitive to the reasons, but say you're a moral skeptic or free will skeptic who thinks nobody's morally responsible? Well, if you think that, then obviously you're going to think you're not responsible. And so you're going to think, even if you think you can shape the world, you're not going to see yourself as a proper subject of the reactive attitudes because you don't think anybody is morally responsible. So skeptics don't see themselves as appropriate targets of the reactive. They don't see anybody as an appropriate target of the reactive attitudes. But if a normal, rational agent can be at least sort of subjectively justified or subjectively rational in being a skeptic, because maybe the reasons that they have seem to support that conclusion, then it seems like they're going to be excused. They're not going to be free or responsible. But that seems a little odd. So seems like there's a problem with the account, maybe. All right, and then there's the problem with the relevance of the counterfactual worlds. This is not exactly how, really not much at all, how McKenna talks about this worry. I kind of changed it, but his is a little sort of technical, his worry. That's, I think, a little too far afield for us. But there, you might think of this other worry with counterfactual worlds. And by counterfactual worlds, I mean this view requires you to, if you're asking about whether the person is free and responsible in the actual world for doing something, what this view requires you to do to answer that question is to look at how they would have acted in a bunch of counterfactual, meaning non-actual possible scenarios. Well, what would they have done if they were in a very similar situation, except we told them that they would lose their job if they did heroin? They didn't have that reason here, but let's keep everything the same except for give them a new reason. And you just keep doing that a bunch. And you look at these counterfactual, counter to the actual world scenarios, possible scenarios. And that's what we're required to do. But you might ask, who cares about the possible scenarios? Who cares about that? Why, when we're asking whether I'm free and responsible for what I actually did, why does what I would have done in possible scenarios that didn't occur, why does that matter to whether I'm responsible here and now for what I actually did? Right? So if I can't do anything but fail to respond to the actual relevant reasons, so this kind of gets back to this one a little bit. It doesn't matter whether the agent can recognize and respond to the actual reasons they have in the actual world. It seems to get away from that. And so imagine that it's just determined that you're not going to be able to respond to the reasons, the actual reasons that you have. Actual moral reasons. You can't recognize them. You can't respond to them. But if we would have changed things a little bit, we put you in possible scenarios, like we imagine you in possible scenarios, and then you would have recognized different reasons. It's like, does it really help that in some other possible scenario that doesn't happen, I might have recognized and maybe reacted to some non-actual reasons that are related to what I did? I mean, does that help? If we just stipulate, if we just assume for the argument's sake that I can't respond to the reasons in the actual world, why does it matter what I would have done in other worlds? That's just a question you might ask. Now, Fisher thinks it matters because it tells us about the properties of your mechanism. And it tells us, hey, you're working with a mechanism that really is sensitive to reasons. Because look, we can see in these other possible scenarios you would have responded. Even though you didn't recognize and respond to reasons in this case, we can see with this counterfactual test that you are working with a reason-sensitive mechanism. But the response you might give might just push the question, might just be to push the question again. Like, okay, but in this scenario, that same mechanism we've stipulated cannot recognize and respond to the reasons. So why does it matter that it can do so in other scenarios that I'm not in? Right? So, secondly, kind of relatedly, but it's a different point, the counterfactual test, this testing what you would do in other scenarios, it can't really tell you why someone fails to respond to the actual reasons. So if this person doesn't recognize and respond to moral reasons not to use drugs, and they use drugs anyways, so let's say Phi is using drugs, right? And let's say they have some moral reasons here, but they didn't recognize them, and obviously they didn't respond to them because they still use drugs. Their sensitivity to reasons in these other possible scenarios doesn't tell you anything about why they didn't recognize reasons here. And more so, even in the possible scenarios. So here's another scenario where you don't recognize the reason and you still use drugs. Why didn't you recognize this reason? Well, it doesn't really tell you. The account doesn't really care about that. It just cares whether you were sensitive to the reasons. Right? So, if you imagine some evildoer, some evil person, who almost never responds to the moral reasons, they're evil, right? They're evil. They don't care about the moral reasons. Maybe they care about prudential reasons more. That's not so evil, but maybe they just care about their self-interest more. Maybe they're just the kind of person who says, F the moral reasons. They can recognize them and be like, yeah, I get it. People, it's wrong to hurt people, but I like doing wrong. I like it, and it gives me pleasure, and I just care about making myself happy, and I like to watch the world burn, right? Like Joker. Some people just like to watch the world burn. So on Fisher's view, they're going to be not reasons responsive because they don't react, right? React. I should put reacts here. They almost never react to the moral reasons. And maybe they don't even respond or recognize them that much either. But even if they did recognize them, if they basically never reacted to them because they're evil, and in particular, if they didn't react to them in the actual scenario because they're evil, because they said, F the moral reasons. I don't care about the moral reasons. And they just decide to use drugs anyways because they just want to party. They just want to be evil. They just want to have fun, whatever. Are we supposed to excuse them? Excuse the evil person because they're not reasons responsive in the right way? Seems to follow. And that's a question. So the final problem which I'm adding is that there seems to be a problem with begging the question here. And by that I mean the reasons responsive account seems to presuppose moral responsibility. It's supposed to tell us what moral responsibility is, but it seems like it already presupposes moral responsibility. We kind of already have to have moral responsibility in the picture in order to get the account of what responsibility is. So reasons responsiveness is supposed to lead us to what responsibility is. But it seems like it kind of presupposes it. Why? Well, at least two reasons. One, determining what we're supposed to hold fixed across the worlds, across these possible worlds, seems to presuppose responsibility. Why? Because these are supposed to be relevantly similar. That's why you've seen try to find it, relevantly similar scenarios, right? We're the agent in relevantly similar possible scenarios, right? Where we hold fixed the actual sequence mechanism, but also, okay, so imagine if they were here in some really similar scenario, but we changed their shirt color, but they had no hair. Like, is that relevant to whether they're responsible or not? It doesn't seem like it, right? But once we start getting features that are less clear, we're going to have to use our intuition to say, like, well, you can hold that fixed and that doesn't matter, or you can change that and that doesn't matter. Well, it seems like we're going to need some intuitions about what matters to responsibility. But this is supposed to tell us what matters to responsibility. It's not supposed to presuppose it. Okay, so that's a worry. The second, I think, more devastating worry for reasons-responsiveness is that taking ownership seems to presuppose responsibility. So you have an action, we're wondering whether they're responsible for doing this action, and they say, okay, well, what matters is whether it's caused by a reasons-responsive mechanism. So this mechanism has to be appropriately sensitive to the reasons. If we put it in all these worlds, does it recognize reasons? Does it respond to the reasons it recognizes and all that stuff? Okay, great. So as long as a moderately reasons-responsive mechanism causes the action, that's part of the battle. But remember, that's not enough. The second part of the battle is that they also have had to take ownership of that mechanism by seeing themselves as with this mechanism as an appropriate target of attitudes and as shaping the world, and it has to be their own in a certain way. Well, are you responsible for taking ownership? Seems like this model is supposed to tell us what responsibility means, but in order, they say responsibility is being reasons responsive, and being reasons responsive includes taking ownership. But if taking ownership involves a morally responsible decision, then we have a circle. We went from trying to understand responsibility, but we have to actually have an understanding of responsibility. Unless you think they just don't need to be responsible for taking ownership, and then you're going to get the manipulation worry. You can be manipulated. Right here. You can be manipulated into taking ownership. But if they want to say, no, you can't be manipulated into taking ownership, it's like, well, then you have to be responsible is what you're saying. You have to sort of freely and responsibly take ownership of your mechanism. But this model was supposed to tell us what freedom and responsibility was. And now it's presupposing it as a part of the model. So you have this circularity here. Okay, let's wrap up. So keep in mind this burden of consequentialism. Excuse me. Compatibilism. What do they have to do? They're giving us sufficient conditions. They're telling us what it means, what kinds of things are enough for freedom and responsibility. Okay, and they have to be conditions that people can plausibly fulfill. Also, what's the difference between the classical and the contemporary compatibilists? Think about that. Doing what we want, unimpeded, versus explaining what it means to have and exercise normal or properly functioning human agency. That's the difference. And then, so this is classical, this is contemporary, and then contemporary compatibilism splits into views that think a meshing psychology is what's important, or your actions being caused by a meshing psychological structure, whereas another version of contemporary compatibilism thinks that actions that are caused by something, an agent or a mechanism that is appropriately sensitive to the reasons, that's what matters. Okay. And the meshing stuff, Frankfurt is the sort of main proponent here. Now, keep in mind the different components, the different concepts, the different components of his view, which are here. Well, really, this is the better one, I guess. This and this. So this is telling you the difference between different kinds of first-order desires. One is a will. That's the one that causes action. because some of your desires don't cause your actions. And then there's higher order desires that are about these. I want to have this desire for B. I want to have this desire for A. And then a volition is a higher order desire that adds the fact that not only do you want this, but you want it to be effective. You want it to be your will. Okay, and then you add identification in order to get full-blooded freedom and responsibility. Okay, so just understand the difference between higher and first order, the difference between the will versus other first order desires, and the difference between volition versus other higher order desires. So what's the will as opposed to a regular first order desire? What's a volition as opposed to a regular higher order desire? And then fundamentally, what's the difference between first and higher order desires? Okay. Now, what is the mesh supposed to look like? What is the relationship between all of these supposed to be? You should understand that if you're going to understand Frankfurt's account. And what is identification? At least basically. Remember, there's a problem with fleshing out what exactly it's supposed to mean, so I wouldn't expect you to do that. But just understanding basically what is this? Like, what is this condition? Okay. You can't just have simple meshing. You have to have identification. What's this extra thing? Right? And then think about how Watson and Michael Bratman sort of modify Frankfurt's account. Watson by going to structures, dual structures, as opposed to hierarchical desires, and Bratman going to diachronic planning, these self-governing policies that last over time, constrain the other planning and intentions that you have. And then, yes, review the worries. And then for Fisher and Revisa's Reasons-Responsiveness, don't worry so much about Wolf's. Focus on Fisher and Revisa. What are the two components? What does it mean to be sensitive to reasons, to be reasons-responsive? Right? What is the difference between being receptive to reasons and being reactive to reasons? Okay. And then the degrees, what does it mean to be reasons-responsive in a moderate sense? What is moderate reasons responsiveness? And that is here. So reasons responsiveness is just telling you like, well, it's when you have this certain capacity to understand reasons, and then you have this certain capacity to make your actions track those reasons. And then what's the mix? How much receptivity and reactivity do you need? That's moderate reasons responsiveness. So understand that. And then what does it mean to take ownership of your mechanism? So guidance control, which is basically what Fisher calls free will, is guidance control, which is the control required to be morally responsible, is moderate reasons responsiveness plus ownership. Okay, so make sure you understand those. And what does it mean to perform the counterfactual test? To see if an agent, to test whether an agent or their mechanism is reasons responsive enough to call them free and responsible for that action. And that has to do with this stuff here. What does it mean? Like, what are we doing here? We're taking a person who's performed an action, and then after they've performed an action, we're wondering whether it was free and responsible. Well, how do we know? We do this counterfactual test, where we see what they would have done in the face of other reasons, but in relevantly similar scenarios, where they're still like wondering about whether to use drugs, or maybe it's about whether to eat cheesecake, or whatever it is. Try to understand what it means to do this counterfactual test. And of course, review the words. All right, that is it. And next time, I believe we're going into Strawson's reactive attitudes a little bit more deeply. So we'll talk about that next time. Thanks.